So, let's start. Number 10, continental drift threatened the entire structure of geology. When Alfred Wegener introduced the idea of continental drift in 1912, he was not trying to provoke controversy. He was attempting to explain inconsistencies that geology at the time could not resolve. Coastlines aligned too well across oceans to be coincidence. Identical fossils of plants and animals appeared on continents separated by vast bodies of water. Rock formations and mountain chains continued seamlessly when the continents were repositioned together. The problem was not the data, the problem was the implication. If continents moved, then Earth's surface was not static. That single idea destabilized decades of geological theory built on permanence. It implied that mountain formation, ocean basins, earthquakes, and climate history had to be reinterpreted. Entire textbooks would become obsolete. Wegener was not a geologist by training, he was a meteorologist, and that alone made him easier to dismiss. Scientists focused obsessively on what he could not explain, the mechanism of movement. Since he could not describe the exact force pushing continents, critics treated the theory as speculation rather than hypothesis. This standard was applied unevenly. Other accepted theories at the time also lacked mechanisms, but they did not threaten existing power structures within the field. For decades, continental drift was actively sidelined. Journals avoided publishing work related to it. Students were taught it only as an example of flawed reasoning. Funding was directed away from researchers who took it seriously. The idea became academically toxic. Only after World War II, when sonar mapping of the ocean floor revealed mid-ocean ridges and magnetic striping, did the evidence become undeniable. Plate tectonics emerged, validating Wegener's core claims almost entirely. The theory was rebranded, refined, and absorbed. Wegener's name was mentioned less often than the institutions that discovered the correction. The science was never buried by a lack of evidence. It was simply buried because accepting it required admitting that the foundations were wrong. Number 9. Ancient humans were capable of planning, engineering, and abstract thought. For most of modern science, early humans were described as cognitively inferior. The Stone Age was framed as a prolonged period of trial and error survival, dominated by instinct rather than intelligence. This assumption shaped how evidence was interpreted. Simpler explanations were favored even when complexity was obvious. Archaeological discoveries began to challenge this narrative early on. Stone tools were found that required multi-step manufacturing processes. Some blades were pressure flaked with extreme precision. Others showed evidence of repair, reuse, and specialization. This suggested foresight and material understanding, not random experimentation. Sites revealed organized living spaces. Hearths were positioned deliberately. Waste was separated from living areas. In some locations, evidence showed coordinated hunting strategies that required communication and planning over time. These were not isolated incidents. They appeared repeatedly across continents and eras. Perhaps most disruptive were discoveries of symbolic behavior. Engraved patterns, pigment use, and ritual burials suggested abstraction and meaning-making. These findings implied that early humans thought in concepts, not just reactions. That conclusion conflicted with the long-held belief that complex cognition emerged only recently. Instead of rewriting the model, many findings were softened in interpretation. Dates were questioned, cognitive significance was downplayed. Some discoveries were framed as exceptions rather than indicators. The intelligence of early humans was acknowledged only cautiously, as if admitting it too fully would collapse the evolutionary ladder that placed modern humans at a clear psychological peak. Over time, the accumulation of evidence became impossible to ignore. Today, early humans are recognized as skilled engineers of their environments, but for decades the evidence existed, and it was carefully restrained to preserve an outdated framework. Number 8. Life was found thriving where biology said it could not exist. For much of scientific history, life was believed to operate within strict environmental limits. Moderate temperature, sunlight, oxygen, and neutral chemistry were considered non-negotiable requirements. This belief was so deeply embedded that environments outside those limits were assumed to be lifeless by default. The first serious challenge came with the discovery of organisms near deep-sea hydrothermal vents. These environments were crushingly pressurized, completely dark, and superheated. Instead of sunlight, life was powered by chemical reactions. Entire ecosystems existed independently of photosynthesis. Initial reactions were skeptical. Some scientists assumed contamination from surface organisms. Others suggested the life forms were temporary or abnormal. The idea that sunlight was not required for complex ecosystems undermined one of biology's most basic assumptions. Further discoveries made denial harder. Microbes were found living inside rocks kilometers beneath Earth's surface. Others thrived in highly acidic lakes, radioactive waste sites, and frozen polar ice. Some organisms repaired DNA damage at rates previously thought impossible. Others remained dormant for tens of thousands of years and then reactivated. Accepting these findings had consequences beyond Earth. If life could exist without sunlight, moderate temperatures, or stable environments, then the criteria for life elsewhere in the universe had to be expanded dramatically. This challenged conservative models used in astrobiology and planetary science. As a result, early findings were often described cautiously. Language was restrained, implications were avoided, life's resilience was acknowledged, but its full significance was rarely emphasized. Today, extremophiles are central to biology and space science, but their discovery did not fail because the data was weak. It faced resistance because it forced science to admit that life is far less fragile and far less predictable than previously believed. Number 7, the brain was once thought to be mostly inactive. For much of the 20th century, neuroscience operated under a surprisingly limited assumption. Scientists believed the human brain was largely inactive unless performing a specific task. Large portions of the brain were described as silent or unused, especially when a person appeared to be resting. This assumption shaped decades of research. Brain activity was measured mainly during problem-solving or sensory tasks. Anything outside those moments was treated as background noise. When scans showed widespread activity during rest, it was often dismissed as meaningless or inefficient firing. That interpretation began to collapse when researchers noticed a consistent pattern. Certain brain regions became active specifically when a person was not focused on the outside world. This network is activated during daydreaming, memory recall, future planning, and self-reflection. It was later named the default mode network. The discovery was disruptive. It suggested that the brain is never truly idle. Even at rest, it is organizing memories, simulating futures, and maintaining a sense of identity. This contradicted the task-based model that dominated neuroscience. Early papers describing this network struggled to get attention. Some journals rejected them for lacking practical relevance. Others questioned whether the activity was even real. The idea that internal thought was a primary brain function rather than a byproduct required a major shift in perspective. Today, the default mode network is linked to creativity, learning, and mental health. Disorders like depression and schizophrenia show altered patterns in this network. The discovery was not hidden by secrecy, but by a framework that had no room for it. Number 6. A common bacterium was quietly responsible for millions of ulcers. For most of the 20th century, stomach ulcers were explained through stress and personality. Patients were told their condition came from anxiety, overwork, or an inability to handle pressure. This explanation became deeply rooted in medicine. It shaped diagnoses, treatments, and public understanding for decades. The stomach was believed to be a sterile environment. Its acidity was assumed to make bacterial life impossible. Because of this assumption, doctors did not seriously consider infection as a cause. Treatments focused on reducing acid and managing stress. Symptoms often returned, but this was blamed on lifestyle rather than a flawed explanation. In the late 20th century, evidence began to appear that contradicted this view. A specific bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, was repeatedly found in ulcer patients. The idea that bacteria could survive in the stomach directly challenged medical consensus. Early claims were dismissed as contamination or coincidence. Accepting the bacterial cause meant admitting that millions of patients had been misdiagnosed. It also meant that long-term treatments were unnecessary for a condition that could often be cured with antibiotics. Resistance was strong not because the data was weak, but because the correction was embarrassing at an institutional scale. Eventually, overwhelming evidence forced a change. Ulcers were reclassified as an infectious disease in most cases. The discovery reshaped gastroenterology, but it took decades for medicine to acknowledge a mistake that had been hiding in plain sight. Number 5. The placebo effect revealed that belief alters physiology. For most of modern medical history, the placebo effect was treated as an inconvenience. In clinical trials, it was something to subtract from results in order to isolate the real effect of a drug. If patients improved after receiving an inert pill, the improvement was considered irrelevant to actual medicine. This attitude came from a strict separation between mind and body. Medicine preferred mechanisms that could be chemically isolated, measured, and reproduced. Belief, expectation, and context did not fit neatly into that framework. As a result, placebo responses were acknowledged statistically but rarely examined biologically. As experimental methods improved, this dismissal became harder to justify. Patients receiving placebos showed measurable changes in pain perception, immune response, hormone levels, and brain chemistry. Neuroimaging revealed that expectation alone could activate the same neural pathways triggered by active medications, including the release of endorphins and dopamine. These effects were not subtle. In some trials, placebo responses accounted for a significant portion of symptom improvement. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. If belief could produce real physiological change, then treatment outcomes depended not only on chemistry, but also on perception, trust, and context. Fully acknowledging this would have forced medicine to rethink how healing works. It would have blurred the boundary between psychological and physical treatment. For a long time, the safer option was to recognize the placebo effect quietly while avoiding its deeper implications. Only recently has research begun treating placebo responses as a legitimate biological phenomenon rather than a statistical artifact. The effect was never imaginary, it was simply inconvenient. Number 4. Sleep was discovered to be a period of intense brain activity. Sleep was traditionally described as a state of reduced function. The brain was assumed to slow down, conserving energy until waking. Dreams were often dismissed as meaningless side effects of neural shutdown with little relevance to cognition or health. This view influenced both culture and science. Productivity was associated with wakefulness. Sleep was framed as lost time. Scientific research followed the same bias. Studies focused on conscious thought, learning, and attention, while sleep was treated as a passive background state. As brain monitoring techniques improved, this assumption collapsed. During sleep, the brain did not shut down. It reorganized. Neural activity followed structured patterns, particularly during deep sleep and REM phases. Memory traces were replayed and strengthened. Emotional experiences were processed and integrated. One of the most significant discoveries involved waste removal. During deep sleep, spaces between brain cells expand, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flush out metabolic byproducts. These include proteins associated with neurodegenerative diseases. This cleaning process is sharply reduced when a person is awake. Sleep deprivation was no longer just about fatigue. It became linked to long-term cognitive decline, emotional instability, and increased disease risk. Sleep was not rest from brain work. It was a necessary phase of maintenance without which the brain deteriorates. This realization took decades because it contradicted the idea that usefulness must look active and visible. Number 3, the universe was shown to be expanding, not eternal. In the early 20th century, the dominant assumption in cosmology was that the universe was static. It existed forever and changed only in localized regions. This view aligned with philosophical comfort and mathematical simplicity. Even when equations suggested instability, adjustments were made to preserve stillness. Astronomical observations began to challenge this assumption. Light from distant galaxies was redshifted, indicating they were moving away. More importantly, the degree of redshift increased with distance. This suggested a systematic pattern, not random motion. The implication was profound. Space itself appeared to be expanding. If expansion was occurring now, then it must have been smaller in the past. This pointed toward a beginning, a conclusion many scientists were reluctant to accept. Alternative models were proposed to preserve an eternal universe. Steady-state theories suggested continuous matter creation to balance expansion. These ideas persisted not because they fit the data better, but because they avoided uncomfortable conclusions. When cosmic background radiation was discovered, it provided strong evidence of an early, hot, dense universe. Expansion was no longer theoretical, it was observable. The universe was not static. It had a history. Accepting that required abandoning the idea of a timeless cosmos and accepting that even reality itself evolves. Number 2, randomness is fundamental, not a gap in knowledge. For centuries, science was built on determinism. Classical mechanics from Newton onward assumed that if one had complete information about a system, one could predict its future with certainty. Randomness was treated as a temporary placeholder for ignorance. If results seemed unpredictable, it was assumed that hidden variables or unknown forces were at work. This worldview shaped philosophy, technology, and the cultural understanding of causality. This deterministic assumption was shattered by the advent of quantum mechanics in the early 20th century. Experiments demonstrated that at the level of atoms and subatomic particles, events do not follow strict cause and effect patterns. Particles exist in multiple potential states simultaneously and do not choose a definite state until they are observed or measured. The famous double-slit experiment illustrated this vividly. A single particle can behave like a wave or a particle depending on whether it is observed, and the outcome is fundamentally probabilistic. There is no hidden information that explains the behavior. Randomness is not a mistake or gap in knowledge. It is built into the very structure of reality. This discovery was deeply uncomfortable. Determinism had long been a foundation of physics, philosophy, and common sense. Even Albert Einstein famously rejected the idea, saying, "God does not play dice with the universe." Many scientists resisted the philosophical implications even as the mathematics and experiments consistently confirmed them. Repeated experiments verified that this probabilistic behavior was intrinsic, not an error of measurement or calculation. Accepting fundamental randomness required a radical shift. It meant admitting that certainty, prediction, and absolute control were impossible at the most basic level. Reality itself contained unpredictability woven into its structure. That insight took decades to gain widespread acceptance, not because it lacked evidence, but because it forced a reevaluation of one of science's oldest assumptions, that the universe is fully knowable. Number 1. Observation changes reality at the quantum level. In classical physics, observation was assumed to be passive. Measuring a system revealed its properties without altering them. Reality existed independently of whether it was watched, and a scientist could observe without influencing the outcome. This assumption was foundational for centuries, shaping how experiments were designed and interpreted. Quantum mechanics completely overturned this idea. Experiments revealed that observing a particle actually changes its behavior. In the double-slit experiment, for instance, particles fired toward two slits create an interference pattern when unobserved, behaving like waves. When a detector is placed to observe which slit the particle passes through, the interference disappears and particles behave as discrete objects. The act of measurement itself alters the system. Observation is interactive. Even the smallest interaction required for measurement, such as scattering light off a particle, changes the outcome. The implications were disorienting. Reality at a fundamental level does not exist in a fixed state, independent of interaction. Outcomes depend on how and whether a system is observed. This is not a philosophical speculation. It is experimentally verified. Yet for decades, the meaning of this phenomenon was quietly avoided. Papers focused on the mathematics and predictions, not the conceptual consequences. Scientists accepted the equations long before they wrestled with what it implied about reality itself. Observation is thus part of the system being studied, not a separate act. This principle has profound consequences for physics, philosophy, and even technology, as it underlies quantum computing, encryption, and our understanding of the universe at its smallest scales. Reality responds to measurement, and the simple act of observing is never neutral. Thank you for watching and sticking till the end. We've got plenty more videos coming in the future. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss them. See you in the next one.